The Prime Minister has broadly backed an expansion of the World Health Organisation's powers to allow them to intervene in how countries control pandemics. The global health body will meet next week to discuss the need for a pandemic accord, which would expand the organisation's power and give them direct control over how countries manage any future outbreaks. Scott Morrison hasn't ruled out Australia signing up to such a proposal, which is still in its draft stages, saying the detail would need to be examined. But Mr Morrison did point to his previous push for a probe into the origins of the COVID pandemic.
I have always been supportive right from the outset and was criticised heavily, I stress, heavily, mocked in fact by the Labor Party for saying that WHO should have those powers and those authorities to be able to go and deal with pandemic situations, because we all know what happened at the start of this pandemic. The problem is we don't know what happened at the start of this pandemic, and I was the one calling to ensure that we had an independent process to understand what happened so it couldn't be repeated. So I have been in the vanguard of those moves internationally to ensure that there is greater protection for world health, to ensure that those world health authorities can come and understand what's going on and be able to assist countries to be able to prevent the spread and outbreak of major infectious diseases.
Next week, the World Health Organization is meeting, and on the agenda is clearly the formulation of what's called a pandemic treaty, which will give the WHO greater control in how they dictate other countries manage pandemics. Would you sign up to such a treaty?
What we have said is that we need clearly to strengthen the WHO and the way that it operates. One of our three pillars of our foreign policy is our alliance with the United States, engagement in the region and support for multilateral forums. Today, one of the things that we're about as well, and today's announcement, is about the response to the pandemic. That's why we're announcing today our support for medical manufacturing. Clearly, one of the lessons of the pandemic is that we weren't self-reliant enough.
So would you sign up to that treaty?
Very much, and now Mark's going to talk.
Thanks very much. Any questions for me?
Let's go.
In this video, I'll be explaining why the International Pandemic Treaty, which doesn't actually exist yet and is set to exist in 2024, will have about as much authority as your toilet paper. So to really reiterate that one, it doesn't exist yet and won't till 2024, but if it did, a treaty is an international agreement, a protocol, a covenant, a convention, a pact, or an exchange of letters. It's usually a form of trade deal. So a treaty in and of itself has no bearing in our legal system. So as it stands on its own, it's the equivalent of a handshake between two or more parties. For Australia to even consider incorporating a treaty into law, it needs to be ratified. And what that means is that they sign on to say, we are bound by the contents of this treaty. So literally it's the country saying, I set an intention to uphold the contents of this agreement. Notice a trend where people are pretending there's no distinction between domestic and constitutional law and freaking out as though it is so simple to override constitutional law. It's not. So for a treaty to become part of domestic law, it has to go through both houses of parliament. But that in and of itself means that it is no different to our usual legislative process. They would look at elements of the treaty they want to incorporate, put it into legislation, present it before the lower and the upper house, and it has to pass with majority to become part of domestic law. And even then, state and federal law are completely different, so it has to jump through a whole bunch of hoops. For example, if they did it in New South Wales, it then needs to go through a whole separate process in, say, Western Australia to become a thing in a synchronised way. This process takes months, and also, again, they haven't written it. I also want to take us back a bit and remind everyone of that one time Australia had a bit of a habit of ignoring World Health Organization recommendations, like mandates not being a good thing, and lockdowns not being a good thing either. There's a distinction between state and federal law, which separates us from being bound by these things again. And then on top of that, and the biggest kicker of all, is our constitution is what gives Parliament their power in the first place. And none of these laws can invalidate the constitution. Now, to put this in contrast, the public health orders, weren't even considered a full breach of the Constitution because they were always by design temporary. No legislation at all has had the power to invalidate our Constitution. Remember, the process of putting things into legislation is really lengthy and it's very public. So everything gets discussed and debated and put through in stages. So it really is a time-consuming process. Our constitutional rights are rock solid from a legislative perspective. For people to shake hands and agree on some stuff between countries has absolutely no bearing on our constitutional rights, and it is a very lengthy process to even be considered being put before the people to change them. So in a similar fashion, this is why we don't have a Bill of Rights in this country, because in order to introduce one, we would have to put it to a referendum. And to get things through a referendum successfully, you need the double majority. So you need the majority of votes overall, and then you also need the majority of states and territories willing to agree to that as well. So it is just an extraordinarily difficult process trying to change our constitution. For example, right, we team up and we've got Victoria and New South Wales, and every single person in Victoria and New South Wales agrees with something, and somehow out of everyone voting we actually have a majority of the numbers in favour of that. If the rest of the country, in terms of our states and territories, disagree with that and they don't get the majority, the Constitution will remain unchanged despite the fact that they have more people in favour of something. Now I dare say you would have a very hard time convincing the majority of Australians to vote in a referendum in favour of these insane suggestions of what is within these treaties. It is so not a thing. I can't even begin to tell you how much this is not a thing. And anyone else telling you it is the thing is a dickhead who doesn't understand how the system works. Now, I'm not saying that the government can't do shady things. They clearly can, and they've done so under temporary public health order legislation that already exists. They cannot just waltz in and change our constitution. They also can't just go bang and give an international authority dictatorial powers over this country. It's not how this works, and this is what makes me really, really angry with people, guys. You've got to actually cross-check things before you believe somebody who's hyped up on the internet. The fact that this treaty isn't even set to exist until 2024 should be the biggest red flag that whoever's telling you to be scared of this has no idea what they're talking about. All right? This is really serious stuff. I'm getting really fed up. So if you know major platforms who have been spreading this misinformation about what this actually is, feel free to link them to this video. I'll publicly punch on with anyone who wants to disagree. Also, I'm not about to sit here and let people further disrupt the mental health of others in this community, as well as the credibility overall, because anyone who knows how this stuff works is going to look at you and laugh. An international body can't come in and just simply wipe away our constitutional rights. It's not a thing.